Progressive international organization has rejected Ecuador's National Electoral Council of the presidential candidates for the Union of Hope coalition. The U.S. company Moderna announced that clinical trials of its experimental vaccine against COVID-19 will not give results until November 25. Greek Foreign Minister urges Turkey to continue de-escalation and welcomes the withdrawal of the ship Oruk Reis deployed last month in the waters claimed by Greece. From the headquarters of TeleSUR English in Havana, Cuba, this is From the South. I'm Laura Palmeiro. The Progressive International Organization has rejected the disqualification by Ecuador's National Electoral Council of the presidential candidates of the Union for Hope coalition. Members of the Progressive International sent a letter to the Electoral Council warning of the grave consequences of barring running mates Andrés Araúz and Carlos Rabascal from participating in the presidential elections to be held in February 2021. The organization noted that the move to block the candidates of the main opposition force in the country represents a violation of the FTS. Earlier this month, journalist Carlos Rabascal agreed to contest the elections as the running mate of Andrés Araúz. The Brazilian Institute of Geography and Statistics has warned of an increase of unemployment amid the novel coronavirus pandemic. The institute noted that the unemployment rate reached 13% between May and July this year. The figure represents 13 million people who are unemployed and 1.2% increase compared to the previous quarter. The Brazilian economy has been heavily affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, while the government of President Jair Bolsonaro continues to push to ease the limited restrictions imposed to curb the spread of the virus. Brazil ranks third in the world in terms of the number of confirmed COVID-19 infections, having reported almost 4 million cases, while the death toll stands at over 143,000. The electoral campaign continues to advance in Bolivia ahead of the upcoming October 18th general elections. Supporters of the movement towards socialism conducted a caravan in the north-central city of Trinidad to promote the party's candidates for President and Vice President Luis Arce and David Choquehuanca, respectively, will continue to lead the polls. Meanwhile, an election rally was held in the country's second-largest city, El Alto, by supporters of Carlos Mesa, who is running for the Civic Community Coalition and ranks second in the latter's polls. Meanwhile, the presidential candidate for the We Believe coalition, Luis Fernando Camacho, held a public meeting in the southern city of Potosí, where he called on the population to cast their votes on October 18th. At least 150 members of indigenous communities have occupied station number 5 of the North Peruvian oil pipeline, located in the department of Loreto, to demand that President Martín Vizcarra meet their social and environmental demands. Members of Peruvian indigenous communities occupied the facilities early this Wednesday morning, stressing that national oil company Petroperú has shown little commitment to addressing the environmental and social impacts of oil industry activities in the Amazon basin. They are also urging the authorities to consult them before signing new contracts on the exploitation of hydrocarbons in the region. Meanwhile, Petroperú has called on the authorities to remove the occupiers from the station and protect the facilities. Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro announced the reactivation of 2 refineries, which will provide enough fuel to meet the domestic demand.
I have been informed and have approved the plan for the new regularization of the gasoline supply in the country. Venezuela is already producing everything it needs for internal consumption. 2 refineries have already been reactivated in spite of the brutal attack.
Likewise, the Venezuelan president assured that a survey carried out through the National Homeland System showed that almost 90% of Venezuelans reject the unilateral sanctions imposed by the United States.
Would you support that the next National Assembly, when elected on December 6th, requests internationally the elimination of these sanctions? 91% yes, 9% no. Would agree that the National Constituent Assembly approve constitutional law against the blockade? 86.6% yes, 10.4% no. The national support for the struggle against the persecution, the blockade and the criminal measures of the United States government is amazing. The government of Donald Trump has achieved something.
Welcome back to From the South. The U.S. company Moderna announced on Wednesday that clinical trials of its experimental vaccine against COVID-19, one of the most advanced, will not give results until November 25, excluding any commercialization prior to the presidential elections in the United States. The pharmaceutical joint with Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson are on the third phase of clinical trials, in which the vaccine or placebo is randomly injected into tens of thousands of volunteers to verify that the vaccine is safe and effective. Stefan Bancel, Moderna's Director General, said in an interview that they will have enough data on the security of the vaccine on November 25, so they can after apply for an approval from the Federal Agency for Medicines. In the United States, 7 people were shot and wounded on Wednesday in an apparent drive-by shooting outside a Milwaukee funeral home. Acting Police Chief Michael Brunson said all the injured are expected to survive and were in stable condition at a local hospital. The victims included men and women ranging from 24 to 48 years old. He said police were still looking for a suspect and asked for the public's help in identifying the shooter. Mayor Tom Barrett called the shooting an example of insanity we are seeing with a number of guns in Milwaukee streets. And the U.S. economy contracted at the fastest rate in its history in the second quarter of 2020, as gross domestic product fell at the rate of 31% due to the impact of the coronavirus pandemic. According to the U.S. Department of Commerce, in its third estimate on GDP, it saw the deepest drop since the government started keeping records in 1947. The figure was slightly smaller than the reported in the second estimate in late August of 31%. The latest figure outstrips the previous record 10% fall in GDP recorded during the first quarter of 1958 and surpasses that of the financial crisis of 2008, which at its peak registered a fall of 8% in fourth quarter. According to the Commerce Department, the record economic contraction has been caused by business closures stemming from the coronavirus pandemic. 75% compared to the same month last year. However, according to the report, there was a slight improvement in August compared to the global annual contraction of 79% in July. The association noted that domestic markets have exceeded international markets in terms of recovery, although most remain substantially below the last figures. According to statistics, the increase in passenger air services came at a halt in mid-August due to new government restrictions on travel as a result of fresh outbreaks of COVID-19 in several countries. Authorities in Belgium formed a new government on Wednesday after several months of negotiations, while appointing caretaker Finance Minister Alexander De Croo as the new Prime Minister. The announcement came after a 16-month deadlock following Belgium's parliamentary elections held in May last year. 7 parties divided into separate linguistic entities and representing Liberals, Socialists, Greens and the Dutch-speaking Christian Democrats have agreed to form a coalition government and replace current Prime Minister Sophie Wilmès, who was appointed in March at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic in the country. Meanwhile, a final negotiation session settled a common budget, as well as the decision to close Belgium's nuclear power plants by 2025, to set a €1,500 minimum monthly pension, and to reduce sales tax for green investments. The new Prime Minister will take office on Thursday, when he and other ministers will be sworn in by King Philippe. Belgium has not had a fully functioning majority government since December 2018.
It is that spirit of working together and finding solutions that I felt around the negotiating table, and is in the agreement I concluded with the 7 other parties. We have a solid country, a prosperous country, a country where everybody has real opportunities, where everybody can come forward and propose something to achieve a better result. I am convinced that in the coming months and years we will need everybody. We will need everybody to make our society work again, to make our country work again, to answer our population's expectations.
Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta arrived in the French capital on Wednesday to conduct a 5-day official visit aimed at boosting economic relations. President Kenyatta was received by his French counterpart Emmanuel Macron at the presidential palace, where the two leaders signed 3 contracts on infrastructure in Kenya awarded to French groups. President Kenyatta will also participate in a conference sponsored by the French Public Investment Bank and hold meetings with the Movement on the Enterprises of France, the largest employer federation of the country. Meanwhile, investors are set to sign a project for a motorways concession linking Kenya's capital, Nairobi, to the towns of Naivasha, Nakuru and Mau Summit, while also securing another infrastructure project related to the construction of a railway between the capital and the airport, as well as a plan to connect the Mengai geothermal power plant to the country's electricity grid. Spanish health authorities have noted that the COVID-19 situation in Madrid is complex and worrying after 4,810 new coronavirus cases were reported on Wednesday. Meanwhile, the Spanish government announced it had reached an agreement to impose a partial lockdown on the entire city.
When one goes to the doctor, one expects to be told the truth. As health minister, I speak on behalf of the Spanish government, and health is the top priority. And, well, the situation in Madrid is complex and worrying.
Secretary General of the United Nations stressed that humanity is waging a war of nature during the summit on biodiversity.
Humanity is waging war on nature, and we need to rebuild our relationship with it. More than 60% of the world's coral reefs are endangered due to overfishing, destructive practices, and climate change. Wildlife populations are plummeting because of overconsumption, population growth, and intensive agriculture. And the rate of species extinction is accelerating, with some 1 million species currently threatened or endangered. Deforestation, climate change, and the conversion of wilderness for human food production are destroying Earth's web of life. And we are part of that fragile web. And we need it to be healthy so we and future generations may thrive. Nature-based solutions must be embedded in COVID-19 recovery and wider development plans. Preserving the world's biodiversity can yield the jobs and economic growth that we urgently need today.
And we have more stories coming up after this final short break, so stay with us. Welcome back to From the South. Greek Foreign Minister Nikos Dendias urges Turkey to continue de-escalation and welcomes the withdrawal of the ship Oruk Reis, deployed last month in the contest waters claimed by Greece. During a visit in Nicosia, where he met with his Cypriot counterpart Nikos Christodoudlias, Athens and Ankara have said they are ready to talk to try to solve the crisis. This will also be discussed at the EU Leaders Summit on Thursday and Friday in Brussels. Turkey, Greece and Cyprus have been locked in a row over energy resources and maritime borders in the region. Ankara has been influencing the EU countries by sending research ships with naval escorts to work in contested waters. Elections in Tanzania are set to take place on October 28th, with President John Magufuli and opposition leader Tundu Lissu holding their respective rallies. Tanzania's electoral body announced on Tuesday it has set a total of over 80,000 polling centers ahead of the October 28 elections. Mabruk Salim Babruk, the vice chairman of the National Electoral Commission, said over 70,000 polling centers have been set in mainland Tanzania and 485 centers in the Zanzibar archipelago. According to the electoral body, about 29 million Tanzanians have registered to vote in this year's election, compared to some 23 million voters in 2015. It's really good and made available to developing countries at an affordable price.
In order to bring the pandemic under control as soon as possible, China has been seizing every minute to accelerate the pace of the research and development of COVID-19 vaccines. China has declared that after China completes the research and development and puts the COVID-19 vaccine into use, China will make it a global public good, making it reachable and affordable for developing countries. China is clear in its commitment and will honor its words. At present, many countries are doing research and development of vaccines, and the pricing remains uncertain. For China, there is one thing that is clear, that is, we will provide the world with vaccines as global public goods and at reasonable prices. We will give priority to developing countries by multiple ways in the provision of vaccines, including donation or aid gratis.
German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas has called on authorities in Armenia and Azerbaijan to return to the negotiating table following the escalation of the armed conflict in the disputed Nagorno-Karabakh region.
Hundreds of deaths, many of them civilians. This is a staggering figure. We have had many discussions on this in recent days, including one with my Turkish counterpart, and I'm glad that yesterday in New York, following a German-French initiative, we succeeded in adopting a Security Council declaration and in clarifying the international commitment's clear expectation of the parties to the conflict. All fighting, especially the shielding of villages and towns, must cease immediately. The parties must return immediately to the Assad-led negotiations, and we will continue to stress this in all future contacts.
Offering an update on the situation in Libya this Wednesday, United Nations authorities noted the delegations representing the government of National Accord and the Libyan Arab Armed Forces had concluded 2 days of security and military talks, marked by responsibility, transparency and mutual trust.
security and military issues, including confidence-building measures, security arrangements, and tasks and responsibilities of the Petroleum Facilities Guard. The mission welcomes the outcomes of reached during the discussion. UNSMIL hopes that this positive development will contribute to paving the way towards a final and lasting ceasefire agreement.
The gang rape and death of a woman from the lowest rung of India's caste system sparked outrage across the country on Wednesday, with several politicians and activists demanding justice and protesters rallying on the streets. The 19-year-old was the latest victim of the widespread sexual violence against women in India. The victim, who belonged to the Dalit community, was raped by 4 men on September 14th in the northern state of Uttar Pradesh. The woman's family told local media that they found her naked, bleeding and paralyzed, with a split tongue and a broken spine in a field outside her home. She died 2 weeks later on Tuesday after battling serious injuries at a hospital in New Delhi. The police said the 4 men, all of their upper caste, had been arrested. Dalits, formerly known as untouchables and at the bottom of the unforgiving caste hierarchy in India, are victims of thousands of attacks each year. According to human rights organizations, Dalit women are particularly vulnerable to caste-based discrimination and sexual violence. South African authorities have announced the reopening of the country's borders to all African nations starting on Thursday, while banning international travelers arriving from countries with a high prevalence of COVID-19.
Have before you are those who are directly involved with matters of immigration, tourism, health, transport and international relations and cooperation. And if you are not in a position to self-isolate,